This is Dr. Carmen Guerra. Thank you to all who have joined us today, and thank you for sharing your valuable time with us for this presentation of a very special ASCO-ACCC webinar. My name is Dr. Carmen Guerra. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and an ASCO volunteer. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to learn more about the important collaborative work that ASCO and ACCC have been conducting to increase participation of patients from racial and ethnic minority populations in cancer clinical trials. Next slide, please. I will review next an agenda for our webinar today, and that agenda will be as follows. It is to provide an overview of the ASCO and ACCC initiative to increase racial and ethnic diversity in cancer clinical trials. We will then review the important role of patient partners and then provide an overview of the ASCO-ACCC joint statement and resources. We'll then shift to a fireside discussion about implementation and action. And then we'll turn to you, our audience, for a question and answer session. And we'll end with some future directions. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I wish to quickly review a few logistics and provide a few reminders. First, please remember to mute your microphone upon entering the webinar. Please also post any questions that you might have for any of our presenters today in the question and answer box. Those questions will be directed to our panelists. And then everyone's favorite question, a recording of this webinar will be posted indeed on the website after the webinar. Unfortunately, no CME credits will be provided for completion of this session today, so sorry. Next slide, please. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the speakers for this webinar today. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Lori Pierce, Professor and Vice Provost of Academic Affairs and at the University of Michigan, and a past president of ASCO. Dr. Pierce co-chaired the ASCO-ACCC steering committee that was responsible for this work. Welcome, Dr. Pierce. Next, Dr. Randall Oyer. He is the clinical professor of medicine and medical director at Penn Medicine Lancaster General Hospital, and also the medical director of the Ann Barshinger Cancer Institute. He is the ACCC past president, and along with Dr. Pierce, co-led as chair the ASCO-ACCC steering committee group. Welcome, Dr. Oyer. Next, I'd like to introduce Leila Hamroun. She served as the important co-chair of the ASCO-ACCC Patient Partners Advisory Group. Welcome, Ms. Hamroun. And last but not least, Dr. Marissa Weiss, founder and chief medical officer of breastcancer.org. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us and presenting at this webinar. I would next like to invite Dr. Lori Pierce, co-chair of the ASCO-ACCC Steering Group Committee, to give us an overview of the initiative. Dr. Pierce, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Guerra. Next slide. So I'm happy to present an overview of our ASCO-ACCC initiative. Next slide, please. So ASCO and ACCC joined forces in 2020 to ensure that cancer treatment trials better reflected the diversity of the cancer population. At that time, as you heard from Dr. Guerra, I was president of ASCO, and Dr. Randy Oyer was president of ACCC. And both organizations were committed to improving racial representation in clinical trials. So Dr. Oyer and I led our respective organizations in this collaboration, and I'm happy to say we continue to do so. So there were three key goals for the initial phase of the collaboration. One was to ensure cancer treatment trials better reflected the diversity of cancer populations. Two, to partner and collaborate with stakeholders to gain insights and generate ideas for basically how to move this initiative forward. And three, to collectively develop and test practical strategies and solutions to increase diversity of participation in cancer treatment trials. And as the slide shows, there was an emphasis on patients from racial and ethnic populations who were historically underrepresented in cancer clinical trials. Next slide. There have been many milestones and deliverables to date, and our steering group, the working groups, and our patient partners advisory groups, they were all critical in accomplishing this work. There was a site self-assessment tool and implicit bias training program. They were developed, and you'll hear a lot throughout this meeting, this webinar, the specifics of these initiatives. We had these tools, they were tested by 75 sites, and they tested the feasibility and utility of these instruments. And as a result, we now have 2 peer-reviewed publications that have come from this work. And there's a manuscript from the ASCO-ACCC Patient Partners Advisory Group that is in preparation. These tools, the Implicit Bias Training Program and the Site Self-Assessment Tool, have been released to the public. They are free. They were released as of July of 2022, and we hope that they will be actively used. And we also released the ASCO-ACCC research statement. It was published in May of 2022, and this provides recommendations to the research community to improve racial and ethnic EDI. And we also released strategies to sites for how best to do this. This was all released in May of 2022. Next slide, please. And I mentioned key collaborators. The ASCO-ACCC steering group. These were members who are thought leaders who had worked so much in their careers to improving the diversity on clinical trials. We also had the ASCO-ACCC Patient Partners Advisory Group. And these individuals were partners in every sense of the word to help inform insights for this initiative. We had the working group, which was made up of our ASCO-ACCC steering group members, as well as ASCO-ACCC staff. And of course, we had the pilot sites. We could not have done this without feasibility testing in our pilot sites. And then the ASCO-ACCC staff, we could not have done this work without them. They provided the foundational support for this work. Next slide. So I'm happy to now turn this over to Layla Hamroom, who's co-chair of our Patient Partners Advisory Group.
Thank you for the introduction, Lori. And it's great to see so much of an interest in a great initiative. I think what I want to point out we mentioned before, the slide before, there was steering group and there are a number of working groups. I call this the Patient Partners Advisory Working Group because it was such an integral part of the whole process from day one. As patient advocates, we've often been involved in reviews such as clinical trials where you have ad hoc review 1, review 2, review 3, and then you have the sheet with a patient advocate, which is important, but is also an additional overlay. What was incredible done in this initiative was that the advisory group was integrated throughout the development of all of the initiative. And with my co-chair, Sanford James, it was very purposeful, finding the membership that had to be quite diverse and inclusive in terms of gender, age, race, ethnicity, cancer type, geographic location, but also representative of their own communities and the diverse challenges that they're facing. We also were a group that had our own personalities and voices. Everybody's passionate the same way, but expresses it differently. And what's incredible is that the respect was awarded to all voices to be heard. The quiet one, the boisterous one, the energetic one, and it enriched the product every step of the way. Next slide, please. And I think this really underscores that what's different in this initiative is we are all volunteers and we all have our own lives and our own commitments, but we were given what I call the ultimate respect of high expectations. There was work to be done, and you can see that work at every phase of the way. This timeline you see here was a timeline that was brought back at every monthly meeting, underscoring where we were in the process, what were our expectations for the next phase, also the work that we had to do. What had we prepared? What was the outcome? And even more importantly, how that was integrated. There was a return loop to the patient advisory group, both for the training and for the assessment tools, to see this is what we heard. This is how it's impacted. Coming back and having this back and forth made it vital that this voice was kind of permeating the whole initiative. And since that is the end result, that we should reach out to everybody, it was critical. One more thing that I would like to add to all of this is that the patient advisory group did their work, but was also afforded the opportunity to speak directly to the steering group, to the larger group, and have a debate and a conversation. And finally, it was able to be so successive and uniquely so because there was constant support from the staff that made sure that there was a framework by which the voice was heard, but the voice was seen, and also the clear end result of that feedback was incorporated throughout the whole product. So thank you very much, and I will pass it to the next speaker.
Thanks, Leila. Hi, I'm Randall Oyer, and continuing on the themes that have been discussed so far, I think it's important to note that the gap in trial accessibility for marginalized and minoritized people happens in all locations and all care settings. Our team produced the first research statement that highlights recommendations for actions that will increase racial and ethnic diversity in cancer clinical trials, no matter where a person is receiving their care. The authors include experts working in clinical trials and health equity in academic and community settings, expert professional staff members from two of our leading cancer care organizations, ASCO and ACCC, and our Patient Partners Advisory Group, who are also experts and were given not just a seat at the table, but a voice at the table as well. You can access our paper here using the QR code. Next slide, please. The research statement highlights specific actions covering 6 domains: access, equity-focused design, partnerships, education and training, investment in equity, diversity and inclusion, and sharing data and strategies, please. Next slide. Expanding on the domains, improving access, making sure that all patients receiving cancer care have access to a clinical trial, equity-focused design, working with people who design clinical trials to make sure that they consider accessibility and all of the factors that go into a person's ability to participate or not participate in a clinical trial, partnerships across our organizations, across industry, and particularly with communities. Those are so important, to be connected with the communities in a long-term relationship. Education of our teams to make sure that we all understand what's involved in equitable care, to make sure that we understand how to mitigate our own biases, and so that we're measuring that, monitoring that, and keeping ourselves effective as well. Investing in EDI from the very top of our organizations, making sure that we have the people, the resources, and the expectations to make sure that our care is equitable and accessible. And lastly, sharing data and strategies, making sure that what we learn in one location is transferred to other locations so that we can scale our successes and learn from what doesn't work. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn back to Dr. Carmen Garrett. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oyer, for the review of the important ASCO-ACCC joint statement recommendations. Next, we'd like to give you an overview of the resources that have resulted from this important partnership. Next slide, please. ASCO and ACCC recently released these key resources, and we encourage all the research sites that may have joined us today and those that haven't joined us today to complete the following to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion in clinical trials. First, we invite you to read the research statement that Dr. Oyer just reviewed on diversifying clinical trials. We also invite you to take the research site self-assessment, which we'll be discussing shortly, and also to complete the Just Ask Implicit Bias training program. The following slides will now provide a little bit more higher level detail description of these additional resources. Next slide, please. The research site self-assessment is a tool that enables research sites to conduct an internal assessment to identify opportunities to improve programs, policies, procedures, and ensure that every patient has an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial. The assessment is a quality improvement tool framed around the clinical trial enrollment continuum, and it includes domains related to patient access to the site, the screening of patients for clinical trials, the offering of those trials to the patients, and then ultimately participation and retention of those patients in trials. It helps sites gain insights to improve programs, policies, and procedures, as well as how to mitigate disparities. It also helps access strategies and resources that are available, and to create and or maintain a culture of research and continuous quality improvement. Completion of the assessment provides sites with strategies for improvement, such as diversifying the workforce, or developing a sustainable community partnerships, or implicit bias training and routinely collecting screening and enrollment data to assess and address disparities. You may access these tools and resources via the website, which is on the link to this slide. Next slide, please. Next, the Just Ask Implicit Bias Training is a program that was adapted from a course developed at the Duke University, and it is an online implicit bias training program intended for all members of the research team. It enables clinicians and staff to assess and mitigate biases regarding who is screened for and who is offered clinical trials. It consists of 5 interactive modules, which can be completed independently in about 60 to 90 minutes. These modules then present a broader context of both structural and systemic racism and the role of implicit bias in clinical trial selection. It offers vignettes with real-world examples of implicit bias and guidance for mitigating disparities in cancer research settings. A companion facilitator's guide is also available to help sites continue the conversation with the larger research team at their site after completing the training. Again, you are invited to access these resources via the website, which is linked on this slide. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to review a little more detail about the resources that were evaluated in a pilot project, which are going to be the topic of the next few slides. Next slide, please. As we began these pilot studies, a request was issued for participating sites nationally. And although our goal was to recruit 40 sites, we received an overwhelming amount of interest. And in fact, as you heard Dr. Pierce say 75 sites were actually included ultimately in the pilot. 40 of these sites completed both the site self-assessment and the Just Ask training, while 25 of the sites completed the site self-assessment only, and 10 sites completed the Just Ask training only. Next slide, please. First, the site self-assessment. The objective of the site self-assessment pilot study was to examine the feasibility, utility, and face validity of a 2-part clinical trial site self-assessment to improve equity, diversity, and inclusion in screening, offering, and enrollment of diverse patients on clinical trials. Next slide, please. The site self-assessment initially had 2 components. Part 1 was a self-assessment of the proportion and demographics of patients across the clinical trials enrollment continuum, starting with which patients are screened and then offered and ultimately enrolled in trials. Part 2 consisted of identifying potential opportunities and specific strategies to improve equity, diversity, and inclusion in clinical trials, while doing an internal review of existing policies and programs and procedures. The resulting 7 domains that you can see at the bottom of this slide were subsequently evaluated in the pilot study. Next slide, please. The manuscript summarizing the results of the site self-assessment is now available as an EPUB in JCO Oncology Practice, and you can scan the QR code here with your camera to access that manuscript. Next slide, please. And now for the results that are in that manuscript. These are the characteristics of the practices that participate in the site self-assessment pilot study. As you can see, the participating practices represented a diverse sample of types and sizes of practices, as well as a diversity of geographic regions and types of communities served by these participating sites. Next slide, please. The next slide shows some of the key findings. In this slide, we show you the potential for impact that was gleaned from the research. As you can see, after completing the site self-assessment, 81% of the participating sites reported that they were satisfied with the assessment. And 82% reported that the site self-assessment provided new insights about performance. 82% identified improvements needed at their site. And 74% felt that the site self-assessment had the potential to increase diversity in the clinical trials at their site. Next slide, please. Most sites were unable to provide all of the requested performance data for part 1 of this pilot study assessment. As you recall, part 1 would ask about the number of patients screened, offered, and then ultimately enrolled into trials, and also to stratify that data by race and ethnicity. That component was subsequently removed from the now public assessment that you all have access to, and we are currently partnering with sites to better understand the challenges with and potential solutions for collecting the data on screening, offering, and enrollment of patients in a systematic and an automated way. The publicly released assessment enables research sites to do an internal review of their programs, policies, and procedures to identify the opportunities for enhancing diversity and inclusion and equity. And based on the pilot study feedback, we felt that the assessment was important to release as a resource for sites. We will continue, however, to make improvements and assess the feasibility and utility of the site self-assessment. Next slide, please. Moving on to the Just Ask implicit bias training, the objective of this pilot study was to examine the feasibility, utility, and face validity of an implicit bias training specifically for cancer research teams. Next slide, please. This research is also now available in a manuscript summarizing the results of the training pilot study through an EPUB ahead of print in JCO Oncology Practice as the companion article of the site self-assessment article, which we just reviewed. And you can again access this by using the QR code with your camera to access this manuscript. Next slide, please. These are the characteristics of the practices that participated in the training pilot study. Again, you can see that the participating practices represented a diverse sample of types and sizes of practices, geographic regions, and types of communities served. Next slide, please. The Just Ask training program, as I mentioned, was adapted from a course developed at Duke University by Dr. Nadine Barrett, and it is, as you heard, an online implicit bias program, training program intended for all members of the research team. It is the first such program specifically designed for cancer research teams. Its central premise is that we all make assumptions about our patients that lead to bias. Instead of making assumptions, the training offers a different framework, Just Ask. It enables clinicians to assess and mitigate biases regarding who is screened for and offered clinical trials. The implicit bias training consists of 5 interactive modules, which again can be completed in 60 to 90 minutes. And the modules present a broader context of structural and systemic racism, the role of implicit bias in clinical trial selection. It uses vignettes with real-world examples of implicit bias, such as the one that we show here at the bottom right corner of this slide. Importantly, our patient partners contributed to the vignettes through their lived experiences and were an invaluable asset in designing the implicit bias training overall. And finally, a companion facilitation guide is also available to help sites continue the conversation with their larger research teams after completing the training and discuss as a team how to apply the lessons learned from the Just Ask training to their sites. Next slide, please. In this slide, we show some of the results that the assessment and the feasibility, as well as the utility of the training program. The bars contain a color scheme that show in blue the mean scores pre-training, in red the mean scores post-training, and in teal the mean scores post-training by about 6 weeks. The results here show that the training increased the mean knowledge scores across all key concepts by about 19% to 45%, including an increase in the reasons and factors that result in the lack of diversity in clinical trials, an increase in knowledge about the difference between equity and equality, and an increase in knowledge about the causes of health disparities. It's important to note that all the knowledge-based retesting scores at 6 weeks following the training completion remained above the pre-training levels, and so knowledge is sustained. Next slide, please. The color schemes are again the same here, showing in blue the pre, in red the post, and in teal 6 weeks post. And here we show in this graph the mean percentage change in knowledge scores for the strategies and actions that the participants learned. And what we see here is that there was an increase by 10 to 31% in knowledge about the strategies and actions to address implicit bias training and diversity issues in cancer clinical trials. Not shown in this slide is data that's available in the manuscript, which also showed that almost all the training participants were extremely satisfied with the training program. Next slide, please. So next, we would like to transition to a fireside chat to hear more about operationalizing the training and the site self-assessment tools into practice. For this portion of the webinar, I would like to reintroduce again Dr. Marissa Weiss, Director of Breast Radiation Oncology at Lankenau Medical Center, and the founder and Chief Medical Officer of breastcancer.org. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Weiss over the last few years as we work not too far from one another, and I've been following her great work. Dr. Weiss, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Weiss, I know that you have been conducting research to reduce the severity and duration of chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy, and that you've had some impressive success enrolling a diverse group of patient participants in the trial using the ASCO-ACCC recommendations for improving diversity in clinical trials. What recommendations have you been finding particularly helpful in your work, and how did you apply those recommendations?
Well, the recommendations are sort of like the Bible for us. We have followed pretty much every single recommendation because it's been evidence-based and it works. So one of the things that we did from the beginning was to make sure that our clinical trial actually addressed a common difficult side effect, chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy, that it disproportionately affects people of color who are dealing with a breast cancer diagnosis. Another key recommendation from the joint statement is to make sure that the eligibility criteria are as broad as possible and that people with comorbidities are not excluded. So we made sure that our study was open to people we treated for cancer with breast, ovarian, uterine, colorectal, and pancreatic cancers who had received either a taxane-based chemo regimen or a platinum-based chemotherapy regimen. And most comorbidities were not excluded, but of course we did have to exclude people who had had a recent heart attack because there could be interaction with our study product, people with pre-existing neuropathy, and there were certain drug-drug interactions that we had to exclude. It was also important that we made sure that our study team, that the diversity of our study team reflected the same diversity in the study population that we were seeking to recruit. And that made a big difference. And then we worked with our own patients to develop materials to support the study, the informed consent form and all the promotional materials, the one-pagers, the promo sheets, to make sure that those materials were inviting, understandable, accessible, that they were appealing, informative, and shareable, because so many people make their decisions with their immediate support network. And we wanted everyone that the patient designated to be able to participate and support her or him in their participation in the trial. And finally, we really made sure that that participation in the study was going to be as convenient and as accessible as possible, which was particularly important during the pandemic. So we allowed for virtual visits here and there. If people were sick, they were staying at home, they were taking care of young ones who were out of school, etc.
It's wonderful. So to recap, I heard the 5 important points that were recommended by ASCO and ACCC, including designing the trial to enhance EDI by focusing on a condition that disproportionately affects people of color. You also designed an eligibility criteria that was inclusive of diverse populations. And you hired a diverse research team that reflects the diversity of the population. You work with the community to inform the trial study materials, and then you addressed access issues by creating the option of virtual visits during the pandemic. And so with that, what success did you have?
Well, with all of those strategies that we put into action on a daily basis, and our team worked so hard, 30% of our study participants were Black women. And we are very grateful, and we're proud of that. We're going to make sure that we report all of our demographic data when we publish the study. And we hope to work with you further to learn more about how to continue to achieve diverse representation in our clinical trials.
That's quite impressive. So well done to you and your team. And you mentioned at the end there another recommendation from the joint statement, which is reporting the data by race and ethnicity at all the levels, from who you screen to who you offered the trial to, and then who ultimately enrolled. Terrific. Well done.
Thank you.
Sure. The statement also recommends that anyone designing or conducting trials should complete recurring education and training and evaluation to demonstrate and maintain cross-cultural competencies, as well as mitigation of bias and effective communication to build trust and a commitment to EDI in clinical trials. Can you share your experience applying this recommendation?
Well, yes, this recommendation has to be your living, working document. If you want to improve the culture of care within which you provide oncology care and encourage more people to come forward, making sure people have quality, health, equitable care and access to clinical trials. So our team completed the Just Ask training program. And we are committed as an institution to make sure that anybody in our institution who is involved with the treatment of cancer patients, not doctors, nurses, nurse navigators, social workers, the receptionists, the financial counselors, that all of them should to be trained in the Just Ask program. And we want to sort of find ways within our institution to make sure that those individuals are the internal champions for Just Ask, are recognized, that they can build on their competency, continue to be trained, and encourage more of their colleagues, their coworkers, to also be trained. So that's a really important aspect of it. And key to the Just Ask program, of course, is to really help each individual identify what's going to help her get the best care possible. What are the obstacles that stand in his or her way? What those social determinants of health barriers? to work with our team to continuously make sure that those are identified and that together as a team, we have an asset-based approach to solving those barriers so that each person has her best shot at getting the best care possible, and including getting access to clinical trials.
Terrific. I mentioned to Dr. Weiss as we were preparing for this webinar that she is incredibly committed, as she said, to assuring that everyone completes this training, no matter what their level in the organization is. And as proof of that, I mentioned to her that I was interviewing a fellow from her institution who was telling me about Just Ask and how she has begun to implement this among all the trainees, the oncology fellows. And I asked her how she learned about it, and all roads led to Dr. Weiss. So terrific job serving as a champion for the training. Turning over to the site self-assessment, one of the key recommendations in that a tool is that the clinical practices and research site should screen every patient for clinical trials and routinely collect and analyze data by patient demographics, including race and ethnicity. And so I wanted to ask you if you could share some strategies that you have found effective for routinely collecting and offering clinical trials to every single patient.
Well, we did learn that it was unrealistic to expect doctors, particularly in the middle of the pandemic when they're overworked and understaffed, to promptly refer all patients to the study. So we learned we had to manually query Epic on a daily basis in order to make sure that we have identified and invited all eligible patients to participate in our clinical trial. And this process ultimately delivered about half of the people in our clinical trial came from those manual Epic queries. Clearly, we need to learn more from our colleagues about the best way to do this more efficiently. To set up, automated queries on Epic on a daily basis for all of our studies, and that will make a difference. This is the Just Ask program. It requires a ongoing daily commitment that is very rewarding, and it really is our, working guide moving forward.
I love your suggestion of automating those EMR queries, and then perhaps that is a strategy that sites can explore as they move forward after undergoing the training and the site self-assessment. And speaking of other sites, as we begin to wrap up this fireside chat, we're still going to continue speaking, but we'd like to encourage the webinar participants to enter any other strategies for screening and offering and documenting enrollment in the chat. The chat will be visible by all. And so perhaps you can share some of the strategies that have successfully supported the enrollment of diverse participants at your sites. So next, speaking again about the site self-assessment, it includes strategies to improve site programs, policies, and procedures to support the participation of patients that have historically been underrepresented in clinical trials. As we reviewed in the webinar, there are 7 domains that include patient access, mission and leadership, availability of trials, offering trials, supporting participation, and finally supporting retention. So I'd like us to now turn to some of those experiences in the site self-assessment. And I can begin by sharing that at the Abramson Cancer Center, we have been working for a long time in improving patient access, but that the recommendations from the site self-assessment really crystallize exactly what those strategies that are most successful are. And they include community outreach and engagement strategies. And so at the Abramson Cancer Center in Philadelphia, we have created a network of faith-based and non-faith-based organizations that have greatly helped us, informed us on how to create those community outreach and engagement strategies. They have also been important communicators of those events in their communities, so that we could be able to reach the predominantly Black and African-American communities in West Philadelphia. In addition, like you did, Dr. Weiss, we also developed programs to increase access. In our case, we developed programs also to address transportation barriers, as well as lack of insurance, by engaging our financial counselors to come out with us to the community outreach and engagement events. And in addition, I would say the second domain on mission and leadership, the ACC recently revised its mission statement, and we added one additional sentence to our mission, which I think elevates the goals of EDI and what we do. And that one sentence reads as follows: the Abramson Cancer Center repudiates racism and discrimination of any kind, and is committed to leading by example in fostering a community that is inclusive of all, regardless of race, among our researchers, faculty, staff, trainees, and patients. And that was an addition to the mission statement that was agreed upon by our director and our executive committee, and now has elevated EDI in everything we do at the Abramson Cancer Center. Marissa, I know that you had a similar experience addressing some of these domains, for example, discussing with your own leadership. Can you now share some of those experiences?
Absolutely. I've learned from the beginning that you must engage your leadership and get their commitment from the very beginning. So those were actually the first meetings I had. Jack Lynch, the head of the hospital system at Mainline Health, to all the people, the system-wide people, to get their buy-in. And the new president of our hospital, Katie Galbraith, had worked with Dr. Nadine Barrett at Duke before coming to us. So that was absolutely critical. And then getting leadership at each level, heads of departments, the chief residents, the head administrator for each office, to really get the champions within each part of the hospital to become part of this, really a movement to make sure that that we do get diverse representation in clinical trials. I mean, so much is at stake. We know that. The only way we can know that if new treatments are safe and efficacious in all people, they have to be part of a clinical trial. And it really requires ongoing training to learn how best to do that. And I'm proud to be part of this webinar and to understand my role as a leader within Langone Medical Center and at breastcancer.org, and to help each person get their own agency. I mean, big thing that we do at breastcancer.org, working with Dr. Barrett, is to help each person know how to just ask for what they need, so that when the conversation comes up in the hospital, that they can, activate that and together move forward and make sure that they get the best quality, equitable care possible.
I love how you've turned just ask so that it also benefits patients. Just ask their doctors and healthcare teams for what they need. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then, looking at the domains of the site self-assessment at the end, supporting patient participation and supporting patient retention, I can also share that at the Abramson Cancer Center, we've developed a new program called the Abramson Cancer Center Clinical Trials Ambassador Program to provide peer-to-peer education to newly diagnosed patients about clinical trials, so that they in turn can do as what you just said, Dr. Weiss, just ask about a clinical trial. And those ambassadors have also been trained on how to manage misconceptions that patients might have about clinical trials, as well as perhaps negative attitudes that resulted from the historical mistreatment of these populations in research. For supporting patient retention, the other thing we've done at the Abramson Cancer Center is develop an out-of-pocket financial reimbursement program with one of our partners, the Lazarus Cancer Foundation, which reimburses patients based on a sliding scale that's based on household income for out-of-pocket expenses such as travel and lodging, which you can imagine would prevent someone who has a lower income status from joining a clinical trial. But there are other partnering organizations that sites can partner with. For example, the American Cancer Society has a transportation and a housing program, the Hope Lodges. And so with that, thank you so much, Dr. Weiss, for participating in the fireside chat. We've learned a lot from your experiences and how to operationalize some of the recommendations and the strategies in the site self-assessment and Just Ask training programs. Now we'd like to take questions from the audience. So I invite you to send us any questions you might have for any of the panelists through the Q&A box. Please note that those questions will go to the panelists directly. And then for those of you who would like to continue sharing some of the strategies that you've used to support the diverse enrollment of clinical trials, please share those experiences with us. We'd love to learn from you. And to remind you, all participants will be able to see those comments in the chat. So I will pause now and see if there are perhaps any questions that have arrived from our audience.
Thanks, Dr. Guerra. My name is Lee Beamer, and I'm Chief Medical Officer for ACCC, and I'm going to be helping with some of our Q&A from the attendees today. Layla, I'd like to start with you. We had a question from the audience. Please offer an example, if you would, where patients' voice changed or maybe created some kind of action or response or intervention during the conduct of the initiative. Layla?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I can think about a couple of aspects, and I think it piggybacks very much with what Carmen and Marisa have been talking about. There was one part when they were developing the self-assessment tools and looking at the questions should be asked, but also how the responses could or might be interpreted and categorized. And I think that was a part where our group came together with their experiences and suggestions and underscoring how questions can be perceived very differently depending on your cultural, religious, social background, or your personal experience, or the experience of your community. You know, we had a patient advocate who said that their experience had actually been surprisingly good in one aspect, but they knew 3 or others who had a horrific experience. So it became maybe these we're not getting our input, we're not maybe getting the best actionable information by posing the questions this way. Maybe we should pivot and look at another aspect of it. And it also came, we're talking about the interpretation. And that meant that some elements of, you know, the self-assessment tool and also the development of various domain were modified and enriched with a different perspective. And that was very gratifying to see happen in real time. And then the other side also, because I don't want to speak too long to this, but we were talking about Just Ask and the relevance of scenarios. And that's where the database of potential scenarios just exploded because of all our different cultural affinities, all of our different experiences with reactivity. You know, I mean, in a simple example, myself as a Muslim Arab woman, there would be expectations of how the questions would be asked, who would be my support group, what are the language barriers, what are the barriers? In some cases, it would be the male partners, or in some cases, we're addressing actually these questions to children to come because they're the ones who've been here, could address the language barrier. So I think it meant that the panoply of the scenarios was much richer and much more realistic. Also, interesting enough, anchored in a geographic variety that also was very helpful, because I think people tend to think it's rural versus urban. Actually, there's a huge range of nuances within the rural community and another huge range of nuances within the urban community, and EDI barriers are different. And I think those were 2 clear examples. And finally, I mean, the cherry on the top was to have had opportunities also for those who wanted to be listed as co-authors as the results were publicized, which is really a high level acknowledgement of in this universe of the fact that this voice is a voice that's worthy of being heard and worthy of also helping distribute the results. So that are a couple of examples where we had a very real, in real time change as we were having work meetings and work groups.
Thanks so much, Layla. Those are excellent examples. Doctors Oyer and Pierce, I'm going to direct this next question to both of you. Several individuals have written in about the importance of DEI and access with regard to research, and there are yet comments expressed by potential participants in the site self-assessment and or the implicit bias training, such as, but I've got so many other things that I'm required to complete, or maybe I don't have the time to do the training, or I don't interact with patients at my cancer program. Those are some quotes from comments received. How would you or others on today's webinar respond to this kind of response or perspective from employees and healthcare professionals? Lori, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
We all are very busy. We all have so many demands in our time, and we all have to decide how we are going to accomplish everything that we have to do. This is so important. And I think it has to do with your priorities. It has to do with improving the care for all populations. And it also, something that Dr. Wise talked about, it's something that is important for the leadership to emphasize the importance of this, that it is an expectation of what we do, that we want to make sure that every patient has an opportunity to go on these trials. And so, yes, it does take some time, but if you put the time in initially, it will pay off in the end in terms of being able to have these discussions more effectively and to be able to bring more patients of color onto clinical trials. Dr. Oyer, do you want to address this?
Thanks, Laurie. I certainly agree. And Lee, thanks for the question. I'm just amazed at the comments that have been coming in and what I heard from the panelists. I wish we could do everything that everybody talked about today. I mean, it would really be a home run. But as Dr. Pierce said, we have to make clinical trials a priority. So much has happened in cancer care, really because of clinical trials, yet that the benefits of the advances are not distributed equitably across our country. So we have to each bite off a little bit, figure out how to do it, get it done, and move on to the next thing. So I'm not sure that there's a recipe that fits everybody. I would say start somewhere, start where you can make a difference, but make sure it is a priority for you.
And I'll also add, it takes a village, right? And again, something that Dr. Wise said, it's not just the physician, it's all members of the team. And it may be that patients will interact with members of the team more effectively than the physician because they may have more time to work with them. And the bottom line is there have been studies, an amazing study recently reported showed that something that we already knew. If you ask a patient to go on a study, whether they are Black or white or whatever ethnicity, they will go on at the same rate as white patients. So you just have to ask. You just have to take that time and be prepared and have those discussions, and patients will go on clinical trials. So the rewards are right there, and we need to take the steps to achieve those rewards.
I would also add that the Just Ask training program is so well done. It takes about an hour and 15 minutes. It's a great investment in your role, in your practice, in your hospital, and your hospital's culture. And once you start it, you will realize that you will learn something immediately useful, urgent, and important, and shareable. And you're part of a much bigger community of people that are trying to make the world of cancer patients better and healthier. So it's so well done. I really urge everyone to do the Just Ask training program and the self-assessment.
And if I may just ask one end note, because ultimately this is all about the patient, right? We live in a universe of medicine and clinical trials where we're doing miracles with technology, advanced research, all the incredible things. This is something, we're all professionals. We know it takes time, but it's relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of the investment in time that it takes to do that once and the sensitivity that it brings to all the practitioners to then be able to simply reach out and say, let's ask the right question and bring you into the trials. So I think from the perspective of the humanity, what we try to do, we're very aware that it will take time, but the reward of this investment, and to Marisa's point, once it becomes integrated, it can be easily replicated across as conversations with people that you're bringing up, that you are mentoring, or people in parallel but similar situations. The end result is so incredible for a tool that's not requiring a huge financial input as what you'd have from a technological perspective. And I understand that time is money, but I think that's what we underscore. It's that you do it once, it can get maintained. But from a patient perspective, the fact that you speak a language that brings me in and takes me away from a place of fear and brings me into a place of security. And by the way, by enrolling more, it's the impact of distributing the end results to such a broader community is something that it's not just a no-brainer, it's worth that small investment in time in the very, very busy lives of all of us.
Right. And for each healthcare professional that does take the Just Ask training program, you are incrementally making the culture of care of your clinical facility, your treatment facility, a better place.
Yeah.
So I have seen that and felt that incrementally, and it's really a definite benefit to the whole culture of the hospital.
Thank you to all of you for answering those questions. I knew we would have more questions than time. ASCO and ACCC staff will do our very, very best to follow up on all of the comments and questions through our panelists' lens, and we will communicate with you. I really appreciate how we ended that, Leila and Dr. Weiss. Thank you. I saw in the chat, I love this approach, nothing about us without us. I think you have all echoed that sentiment in your remarks today. So thank you so much. I'll wrap up the Q&A so we can close today's webinar, and we will plan for more follow-up with all of you. Back to the panelists, and thank you.
So future directions. And first, I want to thank Dr. Guerra for all the work that she has done for this and for her leadership in this area. But future directions. So ASCO and ACCC, we will continue to disseminate and promote the implementation of the joint research statement, the training program, and the site self-assessment tool. And each organization, we will continue to work together, but each organization will continue to enhance the existing site self-assessment. That will be more on the ASCO side, and the implicit bias training, more on the ACCC side, as warranted from the feedback that we receive. And ASCO is conducting research to understand and address site barriers for collecting and assessing screening and enrollment data. We need to understand more of what's going on in the practices so we can help them to address the barriers in assessing screening and enrollment data. Next slide. So, call to action. Please use these tools. Use the Just Ask training and the site self-assessment and provide feedback. And please spread the word. We need to collectively move this forward. And as you've heard many times in this webinar, here is the link that you can access these tools, or you can scan the QR code. Next slide. And I hope that you will attend the ACCC, the 49th annual meeting of ACCC, which is in March in Washington, D.C. And next slide. And that you will come to ASCO. Either in person or virtual. And of course, that is in Chicago, June 2nd through the 6th. And then finally, last slide. On behalf of ASCO and ACCC, I want to thank you for joining the webinar today. And I want to thank you for your commitment to increasing diverse participation in cancer clinical trials. Thank you so much.